I have to carry this water because I seem to be losing my voice, of course. Since the other speakers have been talking about emotions, I thought I would start by admitting to you my main emotion about being asked to do this presentation in this particular company. After the initial flattery faded, that emotion was acute anxiety, because I am a very rigid linear thinker. I mean, I know what is wonderful about pop tech is the eclectic nature of everything, but I'm not an eclectic kind of gal. So I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, how am I going to relate what I know about family and marriage and love and into a graceful segue from the fascinating research that Liz and Orla were telling you. And I finally came up with two somewhat tenuously linked points. And since I'm also not a PowerPoint kind of gal, I did, however, need a cheat sheet. So I've put each of them up. I'm going to have one to help me remember what I need to get to in the time that I have. So let me have my first slide here, my cheat sheet. The first point I want to make today takes off from what Orla was just talking about, the sense that there are sort of emotions that you can recognize, I think, not only across cultures, across individuals, even across time periods. But there is tremendous variation in how those emotions are valued, in what settings they may seem to be appropriate. And the one, of course, that jumps to mind in my own research is the emotion of love, especially in conjunction with marriage. You know, every culture in the world that we know of knows that there's such a thing as romantic love. But in most cultures, and through most of history, this is not an emotion that is celebrated, especially in conjunction with marriage. In traditional India, falling in love was considered a dangerous, antisocial act, a challenge to the family. In ancient China, the traditional word for love in China meant an illicit, socially disapproved relationship. It wasn't until the 1920s that a group of intellectuals decided they needed to invent a new word to describe the new kind of love that was being acceptable between husband and wife. In the European tradition, you know, most of our conventions of romantic love are inherited from the originators of courtly love in southern France. But their idea of love was that it is something that could not possibly exist within marriage. The main chronicler of the conventions of courtly love, Andreas Capellanus, once wrote that marriage is no excuse for not loving. And by that he meant not loving someone outside the marriage. In the 17th century, Christian moralists continually scolded wives who used endearing nicknames for their husbands, because that kind of expression of love was a contradiction to the awe and fear that marriage was supposed to be about in terms of the relations between men and women. And as late as the 18th century, the word love was used much more often for neighbors, kin, and God than it was for spouses. It wasn't until the late 18th century that what we now think of as the essence of love and marriage, going together like a horse and carriage, it became respectable to encourage people to make their choices. For the reason that people were so historically suspicious about love is that marriage for thousands of years had very little to do with the individual relationship between a man and a woman. I'm old enough to remember I grew up in the 60s when the anthropologists were telling us that marriage was invented to protect women and children. And then a lot of feminist anthropologists came along in the 70s and said, no, 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 marriage was invented to oppress women and children. And the more I study marriage, the more I'm convinced that the invention of marriage had nothing at all to do with the relationship between the man and the woman. Marriage was invented to get in-laws. It was a way of turning strangers into relatives, of making peace. That's why the word for wife in many languages means peace weaver. As societies became more stratified, marriage became a way of getting connected in-laws. And as such, it became a center of maneuvering and control and coercion and betrayal for thousands and thousands of years. The upper class used marriage to seal military alliances, to sign peace treaties, to consolidate wealth, to increase their claim to social power. You know, my son is, we're descended from Charlemagne, and so I need to marry someone also descended from Charlemagne in order to strengthen my claim to the throne. For the middle classes, it was a business alliance, a way of getting connected in-laws, and even in the lower classes, it was a way of expanding your family labor force, getting new connections. So love, for thousands of years, marriage was just much too important to leave it up to individual choice, and especially an individual choice based on something so irrational as the feeling of love. As I said, it wasn't until the late 18th century that this new radical idea came along. Part of it was the Enlightenment, the idea that the older generation shouldn't dictate to the younger, and the state shouldn't dictate to the younger generation. And part of it were the individualistic ideas of the revolutionary era in France and America, the Declaration of Independence, with its claim that people are entitled to the pursuit of happiness, and that goes for personal relationships as well. And they ought to pursue happiness in marriage and on the basis of love. And you know what's fascinating is that immediately social conservatives of the day, defenders of what was then the traditional marriage, political and economic convenience, were absolutely horrified. They said, oh my gosh, if you make marriage about love, how are we going to get the right people to marry? You know, if my son can say, I don't love her, you know, stupid reason like that. How are we going to prevent the wrong people from marrying? Today, the debate is, well, you know, gays and lesbians are saying, well, if marriage is about love and sexual satisfaction and it no longer has to be about gender roles, why can't we have access to marriage? In the 18th century, they were afraid that poor people would want access to marriage. The other thing they were worried about is, if you say marriage is about love and mutual respect, what's going to prevent people from demanding a divorce? If the marriage does not turn out to be about that? What's going to prevent people from saying, hey, it's just as respectable to have a love child? It's no accident that children born outside of marriage were called love children through the ages. That it's just as respectable to have a love child as it is to enter a marriage that is not based on love. And what scared them more than anything was, if you tell people that marriage is about love, men who expect to love their wives might start giving in to them, and then where are we going to end up? Almost, and we're getting there. In other words, they were frightened that marriage might be, that love might be the death of marriage. And you know, they had a very good point, because that is a very radical, destabilizing idea. For 150 years, right up through the 1950s and 1960s, though, those destabilizing aspects of the notion of marrying for love were held in check by laws that prevented people from just getting divorced when they wanted to, by the penalties for illegitimacy that made it very difficult to have a love child without marriage, by the economic and legal subordination of women, and by the very strict gender roles between husband and wives that sort of made it that a woman couldn't exist without a man to be the breadwinner, and a man couldn't exist without a woman to take care of the children and the family and cook the meals and all that sort of thing. Well, in the last 35 years, all of those obstacles to the radical implications of the love match have been overturned. And the result has been a tremendous paradox, a paradox that, in my own rigid, linear way, I think I can relate to Liz's work on happiness. But that I want to start by just outlining it, that the very things that have made marriage as a relationship and as a love relationship more rewarding have made marriage as an institution less stable. And we end up with this paradox that when it works, a marriage today is fairer, more fulfilling, more intimate, more passionate, more faithful, more loving than most couples of the past would ever have dared to imagine. But if it doesn't work that way, it seems less bearable to people. And relationships that might have seemed bearable 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, just seem intolerable as our expectations have arisen. Now, some people conclude from that that we should lower our expectations of marriage. I wouldn't argue that, having studied the low expectation marriages of the past. But I think we have to redefine our notions of love. And that brings me to a paradox that I do think connects to what Liz was talking about. And that is, when it comes to what makes for a happy marriage in contemporary America today, as compared to, say, what makes for a really exciting courtship, the strongest emotions are not necessarily the ones that sustain the most satisfying relationships. And sometimes the things that we think are the emotional core of a marriage and are going to be the most satisfying, like Liz said about, when we think that, oh, we'll have a lot of money, I got to spend it on myself, that'll make me happy. That actually is not what really counts. So I want to spend the rest of my time talking about a couple of pieces of research that we know about what really counts. And it's just stunning how all the things we used to think we know about what makes for stable marriages and satisfying marriages are being turned on their head, It used to be, if you were a woman and you wanted a pretty stable relationship in the 1950s, you were best off to marry a man who believed strongly in male breadwinning and in conventional gender roles. The unconventional ones were not a very good marriage bet. Those were the marriages that lasted. Today, it's men with conventional gender roles who are more likely to divorce, or perhaps to be divorced. And although when a woman went to work, that used to destabilize a marriage, now it stabilizes a marriage. And in fact, the need for sharing and friendship is really different than it was back in the 1950s and 60s, when you could have a pretty good relationship based upon kind of a set of stereotypes. Today, for example, breadwinner families are actually more likely to divorce than families that share housekeeping and breadwinning more equally. So there are a couple of things as we look at this, just in terms of the realm of emotions, that I think are very important to understand. I'm going to concentrate on two today. The first is the whole question, some wonderful research that's been done by John Gottman, a professor at the University of Washington in psychology, also a member of the Council on Contemporary Families. And for many, many years, he's been doing this interesting set of studies where he takes newlyweds and he puts them in this apartment overlooking Lake Union. And it's really, really nice. They get to stay there a couple days. It's, sort of like a bed and breakfast, only it's wired for sound. And he's been trying to figure out whether there is a pattern of interactions that when you go back over time and you look which of these marriages divorced, which split up and which stayed together, can we look back at their interactions as newlyweds and see if there are any patterns? This is not exactly the same as predicting it. I know Malcolm Gladwell said that he could predict marriages. That's not really true. This is a retrospective thing, but he did found a very interesting retrospective pattern in differences between the marriages that stayed together and did not. And he said it was really a surprise to him, because at first he thought it would have to be with these emotional, big interactions. How much did they disclose to each other? How did they handle their fights? How did they communicate? He said, no. The real difference is in these totally boring, mundane interactions, like, that's a good jam, pass me some more. Or, hey, look at the boat out there. And the big difference is in how people react to those mundane interactions. He said he came to think of them as bids for attention. And he coded his graduate students to code them in three different, it's hardly a fine distinction, but the negative ones are, look at the boat out there, the person responds, I'm trying to read here. That's a negative one. Oh, passage, isn't this jam good? Mm-hmm. Eaten with your mouth full, that's a neutral one. And the positive ones are the ones that take it a little further. Look at the boat out there. Oh, wow, yeah. Oh, wow. Do you remember the time that you and I went sailing? Or, pass the jam, it's really good jam. Yeah, you know how you like to put yogurt and jam together? We should buy this. These kinds of little interactions. And they make this huge difference. And I think that it's a really important insight into the intellectual and ethical basis of things that we sometimes think of as emotional. Because really, those, when you think about it, have to do with the amount of interest and respect you have for your partner. And I I told my husband, I'm not sure he obeyed me, but I told him not to come today because I'm going to use my own experience to give you an example of that and what his bids for attention are. We have, as I told you, I'm a pretty rigid, focused, laser-like. I get up in the morning, I get to work, I read only that part of the paper that might apply to my work, and I immediately start, making notes. He gets up, he's the kind of guy who reads the New Yorker all the way through every article in it. Sometimes gives me cliff notes. So he gets up and he reads the newspaper, everything in it, obituaries, everything. His bid for attention is usually a sort of, huh. And before, so it's like, okay. Before I read the Gottman stuff, I actually did respond to his bids for attention, I would say about 75% of the time. Why? Well, one, I'm this linear, rigid thinker. He's got a great sense of humor. It's probably good, and I know from reading that laughter is good for you, so if he laughs, it's probably going to be funny, and my only insight into laughter for the day. But even more important, except now. But even more important, he really respects my work, he understands my work, and if he thinks something is going to interest me, he's right. I've gotten stuff from his obituary reading that turned into whole chapters in books. So I usually respond, yeah, oh, tell me about it, And after I read Gottman, I tried to respond 85% of the time, see if I can up my percentage a little bit. But what I like about this study, though, is that first of all, that it really depends upon intellectual respect and friendship in a way that marriages of the past never did. But the other thing I like about it is you really can't teach that. What if my inclination was not at all to respond favorably, and I'd read that I should? Pretty soon it would be like, huh, and I'd go, yes. And for all the, cliches about how men don't pick up on emotional cues, I can guarantee you that men know when they're being patronized. This would not last very long. So I like that research for that. But there's one other piece of research that I think you can learn from. And I'm going to end with that in the hopes that it will be a nice enough message that you'll forgive the lack of the kind of rigid linear connection that I was hoping to make with the other two speakers. And that is what we know about marital satisfaction and what parts of it are changing. Now, since the 1950s, 60s, I have to admit that the two best predictors of a man's satisfaction with marriage have not changed. One is how little criticism he gets, and the other is how much sex he gets. But how he avoids criticism and gets sex has changed immensely from the days when women really couldn't afford to criticize because they were economically dependent on men, legally subordinate to them, often had to put up with sex because that was part of the legal definition of a woman's role, and there was no such thing as marital rape beside it. Now it's a really different kind of situation that requires much more give and take. What are the two best predictors of a woman's satisfaction with marriage? One is the emotional connection she has. That hasn't really changed in the 60s, but a new one, just has roared up there in the last few years, is the man's contribution to housework and childcare. So does this mean that we're getting into a situation where, we're going to have all these fights between men and women, and a lot of people have been, very pessimistic, how can we get men to do this unpleasant chore of housework, or guy I talked with in a panel, that's how can we get women to tamp down their expectations? No. There's a really win-win situation here. It turns out that the very best predictor of how little criticism a woman feels toward her husband and the very best predictor of how sexually attractive she finds her husband is how much housework and childcare he does. So I'd like to leave you with that particular lesson.